The courtroom in Monterey County was filled with an electric buzz of anticipation as the case of Clint Eastwood versus Gerald Madsen was about to begin. This wasn't just any legal battle. It was a Hollywood legend standing in a courtroom, taking on a powerful real estate developer. Eastwood, known for his decades of portraying justice seekers on screen, was now fighting a real-life battle for justice. The case centered around a property dispute in Carmel by the Sea, where Madsen had allegedly built part of a luxury condominium on Eastwood's land without permission. Initially, Eastwood had attempted to resolve the issue through formal complaints, letters, and legal notices, but his concerns had been repeatedly ignored. Now he stood in court, choosing to represent himself, in a move that shocked and amused the spectators. As Judge Wallace Bridger entered the courtroom, his expression carried an air of skepticism. A seasoned judge in his 60s, Bridger had seen countless cases, but this was something new. He adjusted his glasses and smirked as he glanced at the plaintiff standing before him. "Mr. Eastwood, I understand you have chosen to represent yourself," he said, tapping his gavel once for effect. Eastwood, despite being 94 years old, stood tall, his blue eyes sharp as ever. "That's right," he said, his voice steady and firm. A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom. Some people shook their heads in disbelief, others grinned, expecting a spectacle. Even Madsen, seated confidently beside his high-powered attorney, let out a chuckle. Judge Bridger leaned forward, clearly entertained. "You do understand that legal proceedings are not Hollywood scripts, don't you? There are rules, procedures. This isn't as simple as delivering a monologue and riding off into the sunset." The laughter grew louder, with reporters scribbling notes, some whispering about how this trial would be a media sensation. But Eastwood didn't react. He let the laughter play out, his face remaining expressionless. When the noise died down, he finally spoke, his tone calm and measured. "I know the rules, Your Honor, and I know the law." The amused expression on Judge Bridger's face wavered slightly. "Oh? And where did you study law, Mr. Eastwood?" The courtroom erupted into another round of chuckles, expecting Eastwood to fumble or admit his lack of formal legal training. Instead, Eastwood reached into his case file, pulling out a neatly bound stack of documents and placing them on the table in front of him. With a light tap on the top page, he continued. "I've spent the last 6 months reviewing every property law relevant to this case. I've read the local zoning codes, I've studied precedent, and I have enough evidence to prove that my land has been unlawfully encroached upon." His voice never wavered. He wasn't performing for the crowd. He was making a statement of fact. "I am here to present that evidence, and if this court is about justice, then let's get to it." The laughter that had once filled the room suddenly faded. The courtroom, moments ago filled with smirks and disbelief, now hung in a tense silence. For the first time, those present realized that Eastwood wasn't here to put on a show, he was here to win. Judge Bridger cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat as he processed the shift in the room's atmosphere. He had expected a light-hearted spectacle, not a man who had done his homework and come prepared for battle. "Very well, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice less mocking than before. "Let's proceed." Eastwood sat down, his face unreadable, but he had already won the first battle. The judge, the defense, and the entire courtroom now understood one thing. This was no ordinary case, and Clint Eastwood was no ordinary man. As the trial moved forward, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The initial amusement and condescension toward Clint Eastwood's decision to represent himself had faded, replaced by a quiet tension as the reality of the case set in. Judge Wallace Bridger, who had initially seen Eastwood's participation as an entertaining spectacle, now found himself paying closer attention. The legendary actor wasn't stumbling over legal jargon or making emotional pleas. He was methodical, prepared, and absolutely determined to see justice served. His opponent, Gerald Madsen, sat at the defense table, a smug expression still lingering on his face, though now slightly forced. His attorney, Gerald Parker, a high-powered corporate lawyer accustomed to winning, was about to present his argument, but he was already starting to realize that this case would not be as easy as he had initially assumed. Judge Bridger turned to Eastwood. "Mr. Eastwood, you may proceed with your opening statement." Clint stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, as if he were carefully considering every motion. His presence alone commanded the room, a skill honed over decades in Hollywood, but there was nothing performative about his demeanor. He rested his hands lightly on the plaintiff's table, letting silence settle before he spoke. In 1992, I purchased a stretch of land in Carmel by the sea, he began, his voice even and controlled. The property lines were clearly documented. Over the years I've maintained that land, paid taxes on it, and ensured that it complied with local regulations. But last year, Mr. Madsen and his company decided my property wasn't mine anymore. He pulled a set of documents from his case file and laid them on the table in front of him with quiet precision. Madsen's company built on my land without my consent. They ignored boundaries, ignored permits, ignored me. I sent formal warnings, legal notices, and requests to cease construction. They ignored those too. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The spectators, journalists, and even some of the jury members leaned forward in their seats. The mood had changed. The expectation of an amusing courtroom disaster had been replaced by a growing realization. Clint Eastwood was here to fight, and he was taking this battle seriously. Gerald Parker, however, remained unimpressed. He straightened his tie and stood, exuding the confidence of a lawyer who had dealt with hundreds of cases just like this one. Your Honor, if I may. Judge Bridger nodded, gesturing for Parker to proceed. Parker turned to Eastwood with a polished smile. Mr. Eastwood, you've certainly done your homework, and I admire the effort. But with all due respect, you are not an attorney. These legal matters are complex. You're presenting evidence, yes, but do you even understand the nuances of property law? Clint leaned forward slightly, his piercing blue eyes locked onto Parker's. I understand the law just fine, and I understand when someone's breaking it. A few chuckles came from the back of the courtroom, but Parker wasn't about to be thrown off by Eastwood's sharp retort. He clasped his hands together, maintaining his confident tone. You think this is like one of your movies, don't you? Parker asked, smirking. A lone man standing up against the system? He turned toward the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to formally object to this entire charade. This case deserves a proper trial, not a performance. Judge Bridger looked at Clint, waiting for his response. Eastwood nodded. You want a performance? Go watch one of my films. This, he gestured around the courtroom, is real. And I take real things seriously. The judge exhaled, rubbing his temples. He had expected theatrics from Eastwood, but he hadn't expected this level of composure, confidence, and precision. He sighed and said, Very well, Mr. Eastwood, you may proceed. Clint took his seat, his expression unreadable. Across the room, Parker adjusted his tie, feeling the first signs of unease. This case was not unfolding as he had predicted. As the trial continued, Eastwood called his first witness, Jacob Reynolds, a retired land surveyor who had worked in Monterey County for over 30 years. Reynolds took the stand, swearing to tell the truth before sitting down. Mr. Reynolds, Clint began, you've reviewed the property records in my land surveys, correct? Yes, sir, Reynolds replied. I've worked with Mr. Eastwood for decades. His property line has remained unchanged since the early 90s. Clint nodded and held up a document. Can you confirm that this is the original property deed? Reynolds took a glance and nodded. Yes. This clearly states that the land in question belongs to Mr. Eastwood. Clint turned to the jury. That's the law, right there, in black and white. Parker immediately stood. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Eastwood is not qualified to interpret legal documents in front of the jury. Judge Bridger hesitated, but ultimately sighed. Sustained. Mr. Eastwood, let's keep this line of questioning within proper legal boundaries. Clint nodded. Fine, let's keep it simple. He turned back to Reynolds. Has there ever been a legal dispute over my property line before? No, Reynolds said firmly. Clint turned back to the judge. No further questions? Parker stood, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked toward Reynolds, flashing a confident smile. Mr. Reynolds, you've been a land surveyor for a long time, haven't you? 35 years, Reynolds confirmed. And in that time, have you ever seen cases where property lines were misinterpreted? Maybe not intentionally, but mistakes happen, don't they? Reynolds shifted slightly. Sometimes, but not in this case. "The lines are clear." Parker nodded. "That's your opinion." Clint leaned back in his chair, watching as Parker tried to poke holes in testimony that simply didn't have any. After a few more failed attempts at undermining the witness, Parker sighed. "No further questions." As the morning session ended, Judge Bridger once again found himself studying Eastwood. The courtroom had been stacked against him from the beginning. No formal legal training, no high-powered law firm backing him, but none of that had stopped him from taking control of the case. Bridger had thought this was going to be another instance of a self-presented litigant fumbling through procedures, making a mess of things before ultimately losing. But Clint wasn't losing. He was winning, and as the gavel came down, Bridger realized something else. Hollywood might have taught Clint Eastwood how to deliver justice on screen, but out here, in real life, the system wasn't ready for him. As the trial progressed, the atmosphere in the courtroom had undergone a complete transformation. What had initially been regarded as a humorous and inconsequential case was now being treated with the seriousness it deserved. Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood legend, had proven that he was not merely a performer attempting to navigate the complexities of the legal system. He was a man who had done his homework, understood his rights, and was determined to fight for them. Gone were the smirks and condescending glances from the judge and opposing counsel. Now, everyone in the courtroom, from the jury to the spectators, was fully invested in what was unfolding before them. Judge Wallace Bridger, who had begun the trial with skepticism, now found himself watching Eastwood with genuine intrigue. The man who had spent decades portraying lawmen, cowboys, and heroes on the silver screen was now embodying those principles in real life. His voice remained steady, his arguments clear, and his presence commanded attention. The defendant, Gerald Madsen, who had once been dismissive of Eastwood's claims, was no longer at ease. His once confident posture had become rigid, and his high-power attorney, Gerald Parker, was showing visible signs of frustration. As the judge called for the next phase of the trial, Parker stood up, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call our next witness, Mr. James Whitaker, a senior land assessor." A balding man in his early 60s walked up to the witness stand, his expression neutral as he was sworn in. He had been brought in to challenge Eastwood's claims, to offer an expert opinion that could cast doubt on the case. Parker wasted no time in launching his carefully planned line of questioning. "Mr. Whitaker, you've been a land assessor for over 35 years, correct?" "Yes, sir," Whitaker replied. "And in that time, have you come across cases where property disputes have been misinterpreted due to outdated surveys or inaccurate boundary markers?" "Of course," Whitaker said, nodding. "It happens more often than people think. Even legally recorded boundaries can sometimes be subject to minor adjustments based on updated surveys." Parker turned toward the jury, gesturing subtly as if guiding them toward his conclusion. "Would you say it's possible that Mr. Eastwood's claim, while understandable, may be based on an outdated interpretation of his property's true legal boundary?" Whitaker hesitated before answering. "I would say it's possible," he admitted. Parker smiled, satisfied. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. No further questions." He stepped back confidently, believing he had scored a much-needed point for the defense. But then, Clint Eastwood stood up. He didn't rush forward, didn't shuffle through his notes. He walked at a measured pace toward the witness stand, his boots tapping softly against the polished wood floor. When he reached the stand, he rested his hands on the railing in front of him, locking eyes with Whitaker. "Mr. Whitaker," he said evenly, "how often would you say developers like Mr. Madsen attempt to push past legal property lines?" Whitaker blinked. "Excuse me?" "You've been a land assessor for 35 years, Clint continued, his voice calm but firm. "In that time, how often have you seen developers knowingly build over property lines, assuming the other guy won't fight back?" Whitaker hesitated. He glanced at Madsen, then at Parker, before clearing his throat. I can't say for sure." Clint nodded. "Let me help you out." He reached into his case file and pulled out a document, laying it on the witness stand. "This is a record of past property disputes involving Madsen Development Corporation. Would you care to read the number of times they've been accused of boundary violations?" Whitaker picked up the document, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the page. His face tensed slightly as he read the information. "There are 5 recorded disputes," he finally said. Clint arched an eyebrow. 5? And how many of those cases were settled out of court? Whitaker swallowed. All of them. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Clint turned toward the jury. So we're not talking about some innocent misunderstanding here. We're talking about a pattern. A man who's been caught before and has paid his way out every time. Parker shot up from his seat. Objection, Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Prior disputes have no bearing on this case. Judge Bridger sighed. He had to admit Eastwood had made a compelling point. Overruled. Mr. Eastwood, please keep your questions focused on the case at hand. Clint nodded. He turned back to Whitaker. One more question. Have you personally reviewed the official survey of my land? Whitaker hesitated. Not personally, no. Clint nodded again and turned to the judge. No further questions. As he walked back to his seat, Parker looked visibly frustrated. His own witness had just admitted he hadn't even reviewed the critical piece of evidence. Meanwhile, at the defense table, Madsen was whispering angrily to Parker. "This is a joke," Madsen hissed. "I pay you to win, not to let some cowboy make us look like fools." Parker clenched his jaw, speaking low. "Relax, he got in a few good shots, but we're still ahead." Madsen narrowed his eyes. "Are we?" Parker didn't answer. Instead, he turned back toward the judge. "Your Honor, at this time, we'd like to enter our closing arguments." Judge Bridger exhaled slowly, nodding. "Very well, Mr. Parker. You may begin." Parker straightened his jacket and turned toward the jury, launching into a carefully rehearsed monologue. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we've all been entertained over the past few days. We've seen Mr. Eastwood put on quite a show, but let's be clear. Justice isn't a movie. It isn't about theatrics or emotion. It's about the law. And the law isn't on Mr. Eastwood's side." He gestured to the courtroom. "We live in a world of complexities. Property laws, boundary disputes, legal interpretations. These things require expertise. And while Mr. Eastwood has presented a passionate case, passion alone doesn't prove legal ownership." Parker nodded confidently. "My client followed the necessary steps to begin construction. Any claims otherwise are misunderstandings, not malice. And while we respect Mr. Eastwood's commitment to this case, we urge you to focus on the facts, not the spectacle." With that, he turned and walked back to his table. The room fell silent as Clint stood up. He didn't move toward the jury box like Parker had. Instead, he remained where he was, standing beside his chair, hands in his pockets. "I don't have a fancy speech," he said simply. "No theatrics, no legal tricks." He let his gaze pass over the jurors, each one holding their breath, waiting. "What I do have is a piece of land I bought fair and square, a piece of land I worked for, a piece of land that was stolen bit by bit because someone thought they could get away with it." His voice was low, calm, but every word cut through the silence like a blade. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was greed, plain and simple. He took a slow step forward, closer to the jury. "You've seen the evidence. You've heard the truth from someone who was inside Madsen's operation, and you've heard from his lawyer, who wants you to believe this is all just a big mix-up." Clint let the silence hang for a beat. "But you already know better." Another pause. A heavy pause. Then he nodded. "That's all I have to say." He returned to his seat. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Bridger nodded solemnly. "Court is adjourned until the jury reaches a verdict." And with that, the battle neared its end. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial entered its final stages. Clint Eastwood had held his ground, dismantling the defense's arguments piece by piece. The once dismissive attitudes of Judge Wallace Bridger, Gerald Madsen, and his high-powered attorney Gerald Parker had given way to apprehension. What had initially seemed like a legal spectacle starring an aging Hollywood legend had turned into a battle of principle, one where the truth carried more weight than theatrics. Eastwood, known for his unyielding characters on screen, had proven himself to be just as relentless in real life. He wasn't playing a role, he was fighting for justice. As the judge called for the next witness, Parker rose to his feet, straightening his tie. "Your Honor, the defense calls Mr. Daniel O'Malley to the stand." A man in his early 50s walked into the courtroom. He wore a worn-out work jacket and scuffed boots, clearly a man accustomed to hard labor. O'Malley was a construction foreman, a key figure in Madsen's development projects. Clint sat up slightly, watching him closely. He hadn't seen O'Malley before, which meant the defense had kept this witness under wraps, likely hoping for a last-minute surprise. O'Malley was sworn in, and Parker wasted no time in beginning his questioning. "Mr. O'Malley, can you confirm your role in the Madsen Development Corporation?" O'Malley shifted in his seat. "I'm a foreman." "I oversee construction projects?" Parker nodded. "And in your experience, how common is it for property disputes to arise during large-scale developments?" O'Malley hesitated before answering. "It happens." Parker smiled slightly, sensing an opportunity. "And would you say that such disputes are often a result of misunderstandings? That sometimes property lines aren't as clear as they seem?" O'Malley exhaled, glancing toward Madsen. "Sometimes." Parker continued pressing. "So, in the case of Mr. Eastwood's land, is it possible that any encroachment was purely accidental?" O'Malley hesitated again. Clint leaned forward slightly, watching the man's expression. There was something off, something that didn't quite sit right. O'Malley swallowed hard before finally saying, "I guess you could say that," turning to the jury with a confident expression. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Bridger turned to Clint. "Mr. Eastwood, your witness." Clint stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He approached the witness stand, resting his hands on the railing, his gaze locked onto O'Malley's, steady and unreadable. "Mr. O'Malley," Clint began, his voice calm but firm, "how long have you worked for Madsen Development Corporation?" O'Malley shifted in his seat. "Almost 10 years. And in those 10 years, have you ever been asked to modify construction plans after work had already begun?" O'Malley hesitated. "It's happened." Clint nodded slightly, as if expecting that answer. "And in those cases, who usually ordered the modifications?" O'Malley glanced toward Madsen, whose jaw tightened. "Usually, higher-ups." Clint kept his voice steady. "By higher-ups, do you mean Mr. Madsen?" O'Malley exhaled, visibly struggling. "Yes." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Parker shot to his feet. "Objection!" Leading the witness, Judge Bridger raised a hand. "Mr. Eastwood, keep your questions open-ended." Clint nodded. "Understood, Your Honor." He turned back to O'Malley. "Mr. O'Malley, I'm going to ask you a simple question, and I want an honest answer." O'Malley nodded hesitantly. "Did Mr. Madsen knowingly order construction onto my land?" The courtroom fell silent. O'Malley's hands clenched in his lap. He glanced at Madsen, whose glare was sharp enough to cut steel. Finally, after a long pause, O'Malley spoke. "Yes." Gasps erupted from the spectators. Judge Bridger banged his gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" Madsen leaned toward Parker, his voice a furious whisper. "What the hell is he doing?" Parker didn't answer. His face was pale, his composure slipping. Clint remained still, allowing the weight of O'Malley's words to settle over the room. "You're saying Mr. Madsen knew he was building on land that wasn't his?" O'Malley exhaled deeply. "Yes." Another round of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Clint took a step closer to the stand. "And did you ever question him about it?" O'Malley nodded. "Once. What did he say?" O'Malley hesitated, then sighed. "He said Eastwood's just an old man. By the time he realizes what's happening, it'll be too late." The murmurs turned into full-blown whispers and exclamations. Judge Bridger pounded his gavel again. "Enough," he ordered, his voice sharp. Clint straightened. He didn't need to say anything else. The jury had heard it all. "No further questions." As Clint returned to his seat, Parker scrambled to recover. He stood, forcing a smile as he approached O'Malley. "Mr. O'Malley," Parker began, his voice strained. "Let's be clear, did you ever personally see Mr. Madsen sign off on illegal construction?" O'Malley hesitated. "Not exactly." Parker latched onto that. "So this is all just your interpretation of events?" O'Malley sighed. "No. I saw the modified plans. I was told to follow them." Parker pressed. "But you have no direct proof that Mr. Madsen himself was responsible." O'Malley glanced at Clint, then back at Parker. I have emails. Parker froze. Excuse me? O'Malley reached into his pocket, pulling out a USB flash drive. I kept copies of everything. I wasn't comfortable with what was happening. I backed up emails, documents, blueprints. Parker's face drained of color. Judge Bridger gestured to the bailiff. Take the drive and have it examined immediately. The courtroom erupted into noise again as the bailiff handed the drive to the court clerk. Clint remained still, watching Madsen, whose face had turned a deep shade of red. Parker clenched his fists. Your Honor, I request a recess. Judge Bridger shook his head. Denied. Parker's desperation was palpable. He turned back to O'Malley, attempting to salvage what was left. Mr. O'Malley, you've worked in construction for years. Surely you understand that mistakes happen. O'Malley frowned. This wasn't a mistake. Parker exhaled sharply. No further questions. As O'Malley stepped down from the stand, Clint could feel the weight of the moment. The trial wasn't just about property anymore. It was about exposing corruption, about proving that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. Judge Bridger turned to Clint. Mr. Eastwood, do you have any additional witnesses? Clint shook his head. No, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Then we will proceed to closing arguments. As Parker stood for his final plea, his confidence was gone. His voice lacked its earlier bravado. He attempted to paint Madsen as a businessman who had simply made an honest mistake, but the jury was unmoved. The damage had been done. When Clint stood for his closing argument, he didn't deliver a rehearsed speech. He simply looked at the jury and said, You've seen the evidence. You've heard the truth. Justice isn't complicated. It's about doing what's right. And with that, he sat down. Judge Bridger nodded. The jury will now deliberate. As the jurors exited, Clint turned his gaze to Madsen. The real estate mogul glared back, but for the first time, there was fear in his eyes. The truth had won, and now it was only a matter of time before justice followed. The courtroom was filled with an air of anxious anticipation as the jury left to deliberate. Clint Eastwood, still as composed as ever, sat at his table with his hands folded. The battle had been long, but now everything rested on the verdict. Across the room, Gerald Madsen sat stiffly in his chair, his once unshakable confidence now overshadowed by an unmistakable sense of dread. His attorney, Gerald Parker, was furiously flipping through his notes, though he knew deep down that there was little left to salvage. The trial had not gone the way they had expected. What had begun as a simple property dispute had unraveled into something much bigger, an exposure of greed, corruption, and a blatant disregard for the law. And Clint Eastwood, the man they had laughed at in the beginning, had proven to be their greatest obstacle. The trial had taken on a life of its own, growing beyond the walls of the courtroom. Reporters outside were covering every development, legal analysts were dissecting the case on television, and the public was captivated by the idea of a Hollywood legend taking on a powerful developer and winning. But none of that mattered at this moment. The only thing that mattered was the decision the jury was about to make. Judge Wallace Bridger, who had been skeptical of Clint's legal abilities at the start, now sat with a more measured expression. He had watched the trial unfold, seen Eastwood present his case with a level of precision and confidence that rivaled seasoned attorneys, and witnessed the defense unravel under the weight of undeniable evidence. The judge stole a glance at Eastwood, who remained unmoved, his piercing gaze fixed forward. Even at 94, he carried himself with an air of quiet dominance, as if he had already won long before the verdict had even been reached. The courtroom was silent except for the occasional cough or rustle of papers. Time felt like it had slowed. Then, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open and the jury began filing in. The room collectively held its breath. Clint remained still, his expression unreadable, while Parker whispered something frantically into Madsen's ear, though the real estate mogul didn't respond. He simply clenched his jaw, bracing for what was to come. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, stepped forward, carrying the verdict in a manila envelope. She handed it to Judge Bridger, who took a deep breath before carefully opening it. The seconds stretched unbearably as he scanned the document. Finally, he looked up, his expression giving away nothing. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice firm, "have you reached a verdict?" The forewoman nodded. "We have," Your Honor. Judge Bridger gave a slow nod. Please read your decision. The courtroom was so silent that the sound of paper rustling was deafening. The forewoman cleared her throat and began. In the case of Eastwood versus Madsen Development Corporation, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Clint Eastwood. A collective murmur rippled through the room. The energy shifted instantly. On one side there was triumph, on the other, devastation. Clint remained still, only offering the smallest nod of acknowledgement. Across the room, Madsen's face paled as his entire world seemed to crumble before him. The forewoman continued, "Furthermore, we find that the defendant, Gerald Madsen, knowingly and willfully encroached upon the plaintiff's land, acted in bad faith, and sought to manipulate legal boundaries for financial gain." Another wave of whispers surged through the crowd. The words hit harder than just a simple declaration of guilt. They cemented Madsen's reputation as a fraud. As a result, the forewoman continued, the court awards Mr. Eastwood full restitution for all damages incurred, as well as additional punitive damages for the defendant's deliberate violations of property law. Judge Bridger leaned forward. "The jury has spoken," he said, his voice firm but neutral. "The court upholds this decision. Mr. Madsen and Madsen Development Corporation will be held responsible for the full sum of damages as awarded by the jury." Parker immediately shot to his feet. "Your Honor, we request an immediate stay of execution pending appeal." Judge Bridger held up a hand, silencing him. "Your motion is denied, Mr. Parker. The jury's verdict is final. Any appeals will have to go through the appropriate channels." His gaze flickered toward Madsen. "But let me make one thing clear. This court does not take kindly to individuals who knowingly break the law, no matter how much money they have." Madsen, who had remained eerily quiet, finally spoke, his voice low and full of venom. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "That land was going to be worth millions. That old man has no idea what he's doing." Clint, hearing this, finally turned his head toward Madsen, his gaze as sharp as ever. "I know exactly what I'm doing," he said calmly. "I'm making sure people like you don't get away with thinking they own the world." Madsen's nostrils flared, but he said nothing else. He knew it was over. Judge Bridger banged his gavel. "Court is adjourned." The room erupted into noise. Reporters scrambled to get quotes. Spectators whispered to one another in astonishment, and Parker rushed to gather his papers as Madsen stormed out of the room. Meanwhile, Clint remained seated, letting the moment wash over him. He hadn't fought this battle for the media attention or to prove a point. He had fought it because it was the right thing to do. And now, justice had been served. As he slowly rose from his seat, a young reporter pushed through the crowd, microphone in hand. "Mr. Eastwood, how do you feel about the verdict?" she asked breathlessly. Clint adjusted his coat, glancing at her. "Justice isn't about winning or losing," he said simply. "It's about making sure the truth stands." And with that, he turned and walked toward the exit, the crowd parting for him as he made his way out. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the courthouse steps. The fresh ocean breeze from Carmel by the sea carried the scent of salt and freedom. Clint stood for a moment, taking it all in. He had fought many battles in his life, on screen and off. But this one had been different. This wasn't about playing a hero, it was about being one. As he walked toward his car, he spotted a familiar face. Daniel O'Malley, the construction foreman whose testimony had changed everything. O'Malley stood hesitantly by the curb, hands in his pockets. When Clint approached, the man straightened up. "You did the right thing," Clint said. O'Malley nodded. "It wasn't easy, but seeing you fight for what was right, it made me realize that I couldn't stay silent." Clint studied him for a moment before offering a small nod of approval. "Takes guts." O'Malley exhaled. "If you ever need a guy who knows construction, give me a call." Clint smirked slightly. "I'll keep that in mind." As O'Malley walked away, Clint turned his gaze back toward the horizon. The fight was over. The land was his. And in the end, he had proven that justice wasn't just something that happened in movies. It was something worth standing up for. With one last glance at the courthouse behind him, he got into his car, started the engine, and drove off. Just a man who had stood his ground and won. The courtroom had finally quieted after the explosive verdict. The gavel had come down, sealing Gerald Madsen's fate, and Clint Eastwood had emerged victorious. Yet, even as the trial concluded, the impact of what had just transpired extended far beyond the courthouse walls. Clint Eastwood, a man who had spent his life portraying heroes on screen, had proven that justice wasn't just a cinematic concept. It was something that could be fought for and won in real life. He had faced down a powerful developer, a well-funded legal team, and a system that often favored the wealthy, yet he had stood his ground, unwavering, and won. As he stepped outside the Monterey County Courthouse, the scene was chaotic. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward him. News vans lined the street, satellite dishes pointed skyward, ready to beam the final chapter of this legal battle across the country. Headlines had already begun circulating online. Clint Eastwood defeats corporate giant in landmark property rights case. Social media was ablaze with commentary, some lauding Eastwood as a real-life champion of justice, others marveling at the audacity of a 94-year-old Hollywood legend taking on and defeating a corporate behemoth. Clint paused at the top of the courthouse steps, taking in the moment. He adjusted his coat, glancing at the sea of reporters, then finally spoke in his trademark calm and measured tone. Justice isn't about who has more money, who has more power, or who can hire the best lawyers. It's about the truth, and the truth won today. The crowd murmured in approval. A journalist stepped forward, eager to get more. "Mr. Eastwood, what does this verdict mean for future property disputes? Do you think this case sets a precedent?" Clint looked at her and replied, "It's not about setting a precedent. It's about reminding people that if you stand your ground, if you fight for what's right, you can win, even when the odds are stacked against you." He didn't wait for more questions. Instead, he turned and walked away, as he had done so many times in his movies, exuding an effortless, quiet authority. The difference this time? This wasn't a script. This was real. Standing at a distance, Daniel O'Malley watched Clint descend the courthouse steps. The construction foreman had taken a great risk by testifying, exposing the fraudulent second set of blueprints that Madsen had tried to keep hidden. That testimony had played a crucial role in turning the case in Clint's favor. Now, as the verdict settled, O'Malley felt a mix of relief and pride. He had done the right thing, and for the first time in his career, he knew he had stood on the side of justice. As Clint approached, O'Malley straightened. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Finally, Clint gave a small nod. "Took a lot of guts to do what you did in there," he said. O'Malley exhaled. "Wasn't easy, but watching you fight for what's right, I knew I couldn't stay silent." Clint studied him for a moment, then smirked slightly. "If you ever decide to work for an honest man, I might have some projects in mind." O'Malley chuckled. "I'd take that over working for another crook any day." Clint extended his hand, and O'Malley shook it firmly. With that they parted ways. Two men who had stood against corruption and won. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Gerald Madsen was still reeling from his loss. Seated at the defense table, he stared blankly at the stack of documents in front of him, his face pale. His attorney, Gerald Parker, was already preparing an appeal, but even he knew it was futile. The case had been too public, the evidence too damning. There was no coming back from this. Madsen clenched his fists. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. Parker sighed, gathering his notes. "It is, Gerald. You lost. The jury saw through it, the judge saw through it, and the whole damn country saw through it. You gambled, and you lost. If you're lucky, an appeal might reduce the damages, but your reputation? That's gone." Madsen slammed his hands on the table, his jaw tightening. "That old man humiliated me." Parker shook his head. "No, Gerald. You humiliated yourself." As Parker walked away, leaving Madsen alone with his failure, it became clear the world had changed for him, and there was no escaping the consequences. Days later, Clint was back in Carmel by the sea, standing on the land he had fought so hard to protect. The construction site was empty now, the machines gone, the damage halted. The land stretched before him, untouched, just as it should have been. He took a deep breath, letting the salty ocean air fill his lungs. A car pulled up nearby, and Judge Wallace Bridger stepped out. The judge, who had once mocked Clint for representing himself, now approached him with something different in his eyes. Respect. "Didn't expect to see you here," Clint said, his voice steady. Bridger chuckled. "Figured I owed you a proper handshake, Mr. Eastwood. I misjudged you at the start of that trial." Clint nodded. "You weren't the only one." Bridger extended his hand, and Clint shook it firmly. "For what it's worth," the judge said, "that was one hell of a case to preside over. I've seen a lot of legal battles in my time, but nothing quite like that." Clint smirked. "Neither have I." The judge glanced at the land behind them. "So, what's next? You planning to build something here?" Clint looked out at the rolling hills and the sea beyond. He shook his head. "No, just going to keep it the way it is." Bridger nodded approvingly. "Good call." He hesitated, then added, "Not every man would have fought the way you did. Most would have taken a settlement and walked away." Clint smirked. "Most men aren't me." Bridger chuckled. "That's for damn sure." As the judge walked back to his car, Clint remained where he was, staring out over his land. The fight was over, the battle won. But what mattered most wasn't just the verdict. It was the reminder that justice was still possible in a world that often seemed to forget it. In the days that followed, the case remained a national conversation. Legal analysts dissected the trial, hailing it as a landmark moment in property rights law. Social media continued to buzz with admiration for Clint's unwavering determination. Madsen's development projects took a massive hit, with investors pulling out and local authorities re-evaluating his permits. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood had nothing left to prove. As the sun set over Carmel, Clint tipped his hat, took one last look at his land and walked back to his home. He had always been a man of action, and when the time had come to stand his ground, he had done exactly that. The world would keep moving, corporations would keep trying to bend the rules, and men like Madsen would rise and fall. But as long as there were people willing to fight for what was right, justice would always have a chance. And Clint Eastwood had just reminded the world of that fact once again. The impact of Clint Eastwood's courtroom victory rippled far beyond the Monterey County courthouse. The trial had captivated the nation, not just because of the Hollywood legend at its center, but because of what it symbolized. A lone man standing up against corporate greed and a legal system that often favored the wealthy. Clint had walked into that courtroom with nothing but his determination, a deep understanding of the law, and an unwavering belief in justice. He had walked out victorious, proving that the truth, when wielded with patience and persistence, could still triumph over money and power. But even as the dust settled and the headlines proclaimed his victory, there was still unfinished business. The world had watched him win, but what came next? Back in Carmel by the sea, the land Clint had fought so hard to protect was once again his and his alone. The construction machines were gone, the noise and disruption a fading memory. Standing on his property, he took in the sight, the rolling hills, the crisp ocean air, the untouched beauty that had been so close to being lost forever. But even in victory, Clint knew that this battle had been bigger than just one piece of land. This case had sent a message, not just to corporations like Madsen's, but to anyone who thought they could bend the law to their advantage. A few days after the verdict, Judge Wallace Bridger arrived at Clint's property, stepping out of his car and walking toward the man he had once underestimated. "You planning on building something here?" Bridger asked, gesturing toward the land. Clint, standing with his hands in his pockets, shook his head. "Nope, just going to keep it the way it is." Bridger nodded approvingly. "Smart move. Not everyone would have fought like you did, though. Most people would have taken a settlement and walked away." Clint smirked. "Most men aren't me." The judge chuckled, shaking his head. "That's for damn sure." Clint had won, and justice had prevailed, but he knew that his victory meant more than just restoring his land. It was about accountability. Madsen had been exposed for what he was, a greedy developer who thought he could bully his way into stealing property. But Clint wasn't naive. He knew that men like Madsen didn't simply disappear after one courtroom loss. They regrouped, they plotted, they found new ways to twist the system in their favor. And Clint had no intention of letting that happen, not to him, and not to others who might not have the platform or resources to fight back. While Clint stood victorious, Gerald Madsen's empire was beginning to crumble. His company's stock had taken a massive hit. investors were pulling out, and city officials had begun re-evaluating all of his ongoing and future projects. The trial had painted him as the villain he truly was, and now he was feeling the consequences. The trial... he felt his head drooping. Inside his corporate office, Madsen sat with his attorney, Gerald Parker, his face red with fury. "Fix this," he hissed, slamming his fists onto the table. Parker sighed, already knowing the truth. "We can appeal," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "But given the evidence, the ruling won't change. If anything, a higher court might increase the damages." Madsen clenched his jaw. "I don't care about the money," he snapped. "That old man humiliated me." Parker folded his arms. "No, Gerald, you humiliated yourself. You gambled and you lost. And now everyone knows what kind of businessman you really are." Madsen said nothing. He simply stared at the floor, realizing, for the first time in his life, that he had truly lost. For Clint, the battle wasn't over. His fight had inspired countless others who had been wronged by corporations like Madsen's. His phone began ringing with calls from small landowners, farmers, and community leaders, all sharing similar stories. Developers pushing them off their property, companies using legal loopholes to take what wasn't theirs. One call stood out. A rancher from Arizona who had been in a similar battle with a real estate group that had bribed local officials to approve illegal construction on his land. "I saw what you did," the rancher said over the phone. "They told me there was nothing I could do, that I'd lose everything if I fought back. But now, I think I might have a chance." Clint listened carefully, his expression unreadable. This wasn't just about him anymore. The problem was bigger than he had realized, and he wasn't the kind of man to ignore it. A few days later, Clint Eastwood announced something unexpected. He was forming a legal defense fund to help small landowners fight against corrupt developers. He would use his resources, his influence, and even his own money if necessary to ensure that no one else had to go through what he had. The announcement sent shockwaves through the real estate industry. Madsen and his allies had assumed that Clint's victory was the end of the fight. But it was only the beginning. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore, he was standing up for everyone. Late one evening, Clint was leaving a local diner when a black SUV pulled up beside him. The tinted window rolled down, revealing Gerald Madsen. "Eastwood," Madsen said, his voice dripping with resentment. "You should have taken the settlement. You think this is over. You have no idea who you just pissed off." Clint remained unfazed, staring at him with the same steely gaze that had unsettled so many villains in his films. "You still don't get it, do you?" Clint said, his voice calm. "This isn't about money. This is about what's right." Madsen smirked. "What's right doesn't always win." Clint took a step closer. "It did this time." Madsen's smirk faded. He clenched his jaw, then rolled up his window and drove off into the night. Clint watched him go, knowing that Madsen wasn't the type to let go of a grudge. But Clint wasn't afraid. He had faced far worse threats in his lifetime, and if Madsen wanted to come after him again, he'd be ready. Over the next few months, Clint's legal defense fund gained momentum. Donations poured in, legal teams offered their services, and one by one, corrupt developers found themselves facing unexpected resistance. Farmers, homeowners, and small-town families who had once been powerless were now standing their ground. Clint had fought a battle for himself, but in doing so, he had ignited a movement. His name became more than just a Hollywood legend. It became a symbol of justice. One evening, Clint stood on his land, watching the sun set over the hills. The ocean breeze was cool, the sky painted with hues of orange and purple. He had won. Not just in the courtroom, but in the fight to protect what mattered. A friend once told him, "You don't need a badge or a gun to be a hero, you just need the courage to do what's right." Clint smirked to himself. He never set out to be a hero. But sometimes, standing your ground is all it takes. Clint Eastwood's triumph in the courtroom was more than just a legal victory. It became a cultural moment, a turning point in how the public viewed corporate overreach, property rights, and the ability of one determined man to stand against an unjust system. The media coverage didn't fade after the verdict. In fact, it only grew stronger. Reporters dissected every detail of the trial, legal analysts debated its significance, and people across the country were left wondering, If Clint Eastwood could take on a corrupt developer and win, what else was possible? His case had started as a dispute over land, but it had transformed into something much larger, a battle for justice, accountability, and the fundamental principle that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. In the weeks following the verdict, Clint remained as composed as ever. While the world around him erupted with discussion, he returned to his home in Carmel by the sea, taking solace in the land he had fought so hard to protect. The construction had ceased, the court orders had been enforced, and Gerald Madsen's company had been forced to not only halt their illegal development, but compensate Clint for damages. But even as Clint walked his land, breathing in the salty ocean air and feeling the familiar ground beneath his feet, he knew that his fight had only scratched the surface of a much bigger problem. Clint's legal battle had struck a nerve with the American public. Across the country, people were waking up to a reality they had long ignored. That corporations, real estate developers, and even local governments had been manipulating property laws for years, taking advantage of loopholes to seize land from those who couldn't afford to fight back. In the weeks after the trial, Clint began receiving hundreds of letters, emails, and phone calls from landowners, farmers, and small business owners who had faced similar situations. They all told the same story. They had been pressured, intimidated, and even forced to sell their land under dubious circumstances. Many had tried to fight, but without the resources or legal knowledge, they had lost everything. One letter in particular caught Clint's attention. It was from an elderly couple in Texas who had owned their ranch for over 50 years. A powerful developer had used political connections to redraw zoning laws, claiming that their land was now classified as public use and forcing them to sell for a fraction of its value. They had fought in court but lost, overwhelmed by a team of high-powered attorneys who had buried them in paperwork and legal fees. "We watched your trial," the letter read. "For the first time in years, we felt hope again." Clint sat with the letter in his hands for a long time, staring at the words. He had won his own battle. But what about all the others who hadn't? Most men would have been satisfied with a personal victory, but Clint Eastwood had never been like most men. He wasn't just going to sit back and enjoy his win, he was going to use it to help others. With his own money and support from allies in the legal community, Clint established a legal defense fund, dedicated to helping small landowners fight against unjust corporate land grabs. The Eastwood Legal Defense Fund was officially launched just a month after his trial ended, and within days it had raised millions of dollars in donations. People from all walks of life, farmers, small business owners, veterans, and even celebrities, contributed to the cause. Law firms offered pro bono services, and legal experts volunteered to review cases for those who couldn't afford representation. The mission was simple: no one should lose their land because they couldn't afford a lawyer. Meanwhile, Gerald Madsen was facing the full force of his actions. The media had turned him into the poster child of corporate greed, and his company was in freefall. Investors had lost confidence, clients were pulling out of deals, and local governments were beginning to audit his past projects for violations. What had once been a powerful, untouchable real estate empire was now crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. Inside his office, Madsen sat with his lawyer, Gerald Parker, staring at the financial reports spread across his desk. It was worse than he had expected. "We're hemorrhaging money," Parker muttered, flipping through the pages. "Your name is toxic. No one wants to do business with you." Madsen clenched his jaw, his frustration barely contained. "What about our appeal?" Parker sighed. "Even if we win, which we won't, it won't fix your reputation. You're lost, Gerald, and the world knows it." Madsen exhaled sharply, staring out the window of his once thriving company headquarters. He had spent years building his empire, manipulating laws, and silencing opposition. But Clint Eastwood had done something no one else had. He had exposed him, and now everything was falling apart. As Clint's legal defense fund continued to gain traction, something unexpected happened. A group of senators and lawmakers reached out, asking for his input on new legislation aimed at preventing corporate land theft. Clint had spent his life playing lawmen, cowboys, and enforcers of justice on screen. Now he was being asked to help shape real laws that would protect everyday Americans. At first he hesitated. Politics had never been his game. But then he thought about all the letters, all the people who had lost everything because the system had been stacked against them. So, he agreed. Over the next few months, Clint met with lawmakers, testified before committees, and worked with legal experts to help craft a bill that would close the loopholes developers had been exploiting. The Eastwood Property Rights Act would make it harder for corporations to seize land through legal manipulation, strengthen zoning protections, and ensure that property owners had access to affordable legal defense. When the bill was officially introduced, it was dubbed the Eastwood Law. Clint had started with one fight, but now he was changing the law itself. Months after the trial, Clint stood once again on his land, the fight behind him but the mission still ahead. The sky was clear, the wind was soft, and everything was exactly as it should be, untouched, unspoiled, his. As he looked out over the hills, he thought about all the battles still being fought, all the people who were still waiting for justice. He had proven that one man could stand against the system and win, and now, thanks to him, others would have the chance to do the same. A journalist once asked him, "Mr. Eastwood, do you think of yourself as a hero?" He had only smirked and said, "Nah, I just don't like bullies." And that was all there was to it. Life presents us with unexpected challenges and difficult situations where integrity, patience, and resilience become our greatest strengths in confronting injustice. Clint Eastwood's story is not merely a legal battle over property rights. It is a powerful testament to the strength of perseverance, the power of truth, and the courage to stand against formidable forces. These values are not only relevant for the younger generation, but also serve as a profound reminder for older individuals who have witnessed the changing tides of life. In today's world, where many choose to compromise with injustice to avoid trouble, Clint Eastwood took the hardest path, standing up for what was right. Many of us have encountered unfair situations in life where we felt pressured to remain silent because speaking out seemed too troublesome. But if everyone chooses to stay silent, wrongdoers will only grow bolder and injustice will prevail. Integrity is not a choice, it is a way of life. No matter your age, remember that your honesty and moral strength are your most valuable possessions. Integrity allows you to live with a clear conscience, earn the respect of others, and, most importantly, set a good example for future generations. Clint Eastwood was not a young man when he took on this legal battle. At over 90 years old, many would have chosen to step away from disputes and enjoy a peaceful retirement. But he stood firm, proving that age is not a barrier to fighting for what is right. His actions remind us that strength is not measured in years, but in determination and purpose. Many older individuals feel as though their voices no longer matter, that society has left them behind. But Clint Eastwood's story is a testament to the fact that wisdom, experience, and values remain invaluable, regardless of age. You are never too old to make a difference, stand up for yourself, or inspire those around you. One of the most important lessons from this story is the importance of protecting what is rightfully yours. Clint Eastwood spent years maintaining his land, and he refused to let anyone encroach on it. This applies to life in many ways, whether it be your personal values, your family traditions, or the things you have worked hard to build. They deserve to be safeguarded. Think about the values you have cultivated throughout your life, your family, your beliefs, your sense of right and wrong. Do not let anyone or anything force you to abandon them. Once you give up, you allow others to decide your fate, instead of taking control of your own destiny. Many of us tend to avoid conflict even when we know we are being treated unfairly, but silence is not always the answer. If Clint Eastwood had chosen not to fight, he would have lost his land. Worse, his inaction would have set a dangerous precedent that powerful people can do as they please without consequences. Whether in your daily life or in more significant matters, remember that sometimes you need to say no to injustice. Do not be afraid to defend what is right, because only when you stand up can you create the opportunity to restore fairness, not only for yourself, but also for others who may face similar struggles. As an actor and director, no one expected Clint Eastwood to successfully study law and win a case against a team of professional attorneys, but he proved that anything is possible with enough determination. How many times in life have you doubted yourself, thinking you are not smart enough, not young enough, or not capable enough to accomplish something? Remember, no one can decide your abilities except you. Never stop learning, never stop growing, and never believe that you are too old to take on a new challenge. Clint Eastwood's victory did not happen overnight. He had to be patient, spend months researching, collecting evidence, and fighting step by step to achieve justice. This serves as an important reminder that the most valuable things in life do not come easily. If you are facing difficulties, do not lose hope. Patience and persistence are the keys to overcoming any challenge, whether in work, family, or personal endeavors. Trust that your efforts will eventually be rewarded. There are moments when we feel like the world is unfair, that bad people always seem to win. But Clint Eastwood's story proves that justice still exists. Sometimes, we just have to work harder to uncover it. Never lose faith in justice. Even when life does not seem fair, know that as long as you stand firm, the truth will prevail. Clint Eastwood's story is not just about a lawsuit. It is a powerful reminder that everyone has the right to demand justice and protect what is theirs. No matter your age or how many challenges you have faced, always remember that you still matter. You still have a voice, and you can still make a difference. Life is not always easy, but as long as you hold on to your beliefs, your integrity, and your courage to stand up for what is right, you are already victorious.